Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next installation in our 90th anniversary series, celebrating 90 years at SILS. We're excited today to have another distinguished alumni lecture, and I'm going to let Aaron Carter, our president of our Alumni Association, do the introduction. But before that, just let me thank EBSCO for its sponsorship of this series, and also to Susan Sylvester and the 90th anniversary planning team, who have done so much work in the background to make all of these events so successful. So enjoy, and I'll see you at the end of the session.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Today we have Kate Moran joining us. Kate is a senior user experience specialist with the Nielsen Norman Group. She conducts research and leads training seminars to help digital product teams expand and improve their UX practice. Kate has extensive experience conducting user research to guide UX strategy for websites and applications. She provides UX advice to clients from a wide variety of industries, including finance, healthcare, government agencies, e-commerce, B2B, and nonprofit organizations. Kate's recommendations and research findings are informed by her background in information theory and design, as well as her development experience. Prior to joining Nielsen, Kate worked at IBM, first as a web content manager and then later as a front-end web developer. She also worked in UX design for a small web design agency. Kate holds a master's degree in information science with a specialization in human-computer interaction from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Kate is based in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thanks for joining us today, Kate.
Thanks so much, Erin. Okay, so let me share my screen real quick. I do have a couple of slides. Can everybody see my slides? No, it's just a little like remote meeting joke to start us off in this conversation about remote UX work. So here's my intro slide. Here's my thesis statement for this talk. The future of UX is remote. Now, I know that that is kind of a controversial thing to say. I'm sure some of you are reading this and thinking, like, God, I sure hope not. But bear with me. We're going to talk about the good and the bad about the current state of remote UX work. And we're also going to be thinking about where I hope we will end up in the long term. First, let me just tell you a little bit about the company that I work for and what I do there. So first, just a little bit of background about me. So I graduated with my bachelor's in IS from SILS in 2013, and then I got my master's in 2015. And I was actually one of the first in that first group to go through that dual degree program, which was so amazing because it really helped me to jumpstart my master's degree. And then I was able to work part-time at IBM while I was getting that degree. So love SILS. I really think it's such a great school, and is really producing a lot of people who are going to end up being leaders in our field. So I'm excited to be back here. So I've worked a couple different UX related jobs, but I'm currently a senior UX specialist at Nielsen Norman Group, which I imagine many of you are familiar with. I first learned about NNG. We call it NNG, by the way, because we know that Nielsen Norman Group is quite a mouthful. So I actually first learned about NNG when I was studying at SILS. I think it was actually Professor Berquist who first assigned, an NNG based reading. So we are founded by the famous UX pioneers, Dr. Jacob Nielsen and Don Norman. So a big part of what we do is research, and that certainly is the major aspect of my role personally. Even though my title is UX specialist, I know that that is kind of a vague job title. So I primarily consider myself to be a user researcher. So we conduct independently funded research projects on overarching patterns that affect the entire field of UX. And in addition to that, we also do some more focused research, more focused studies for our clients. And those types of studies might focus on specific apps or specific sites, for example. So that's one big piece of what I do is the user research. The second big piece that I do, and that NNG as a whole does, is that we provide UX training to UX professionals from around the world. And in fact, actually, one of the courses that I teach is called Remote User Research, and that's one course that I created, actually. So this is something that I think about a lot, and it's something that I talk to a lot of different UX teams about. So I personally have taught over 7,000 people so far in my 6 years at Nielsen Norman Group, going on 7, coming up pretty close to that. So that's a really big part of what I do there is help people to build the skills that they need to advance their UX careers and also develop better products and services as they do that. That's a really big part of what we do. Another fun fact about NNG is that this company has actually been fully remote for its entire 23-year history. So I like to tell people that we were remote before it was cool. Up until the coronavirus, I felt like it was kind of rare to encounter other people who were also fully remote. You know, I'd meet people at, a cocktail party and they'd say like, where do you work? And when I would tell them that I never go into a physical office, they would think it's kind of, a lot of people would think it's kind of weird. But suddenly, companies who had never considered remote work before because of the pandemic were forced to try it. So for example, my husband works at AECOM, which is, I forget, it's like either the first or the second largest engineering or engineering consulting company in the world. And they're very traditional. And like a lot of traditional big companies, they were very resistant to try out remote work. But now that they've been forced to try it, they're really finding that it helps them cut costs, which is something that they care a lot about. So actually, according to this Pew Research study, the United States saw an increase of around 255% in terms of the percentage of people who reported that they were working from home. So despite the fact that we were fully remote before the pandemic, NNG actually was not immune to this big shift. Because even though we had always had our employees working remotely and we had never had a physical office, we did actually meet up in person pretty frequently for our in-person training conferences. So I did a lot of travel before the pandemic for those training conferences, also for in-person research and in-person client work. But then in March of 2020, we had a big global shift. So at NNG, we had a in-person conference, which we had scheduled in London. And it was 2 weeks before, maybe a little less than 2 weeks, the pandemic exploded and we had to scramble to convert this in-person event into a virtual event in like a matter of days. So that was a lot of like nights and weekends worked during those weeks. And we had actually never even tried a virtual conference in the past because we didn't really feel confident that we would be able to pull off a satisfying training experience in a virtual context. But like a lot of other companies, we had to try it. We had no choice. We were forced to make this pivot to remote. Now that we're past that, we are so glad that we did it. We actually have not done an in-person conference since February 2020. We do have plans to do in-person conferences once it's safe and convenient for people again. But we're not going to get rid of the virtual component. This is going to be a permanent offering in our set of training options. And that's because we found that when we worked hard at this, when we thought carefully about it, we actually were able to find ways to make our virtual training just as engaging, just as educational, just as hands-on as the in-person version was. And in addition to that, we found that we could cut costs. We could, make our speakers more comfortable. I love not having to spend weekends sitting around in airports. I love that I get more time with my family. I also love that, I get to wear slippers. This is my footwear now that I wear when I'm doing public speaking versus heels or I don't know, pointy-toed flats or something. So that's a major benefit to me personally. But what's even more important is that this increased the global reach of our brand. So I constantly am in these virtual courses and I have people who tell me, you know what, I never would have been able to pay for the travel to attend in person. I never would have been able to take off that much time or make that long flight. So I love that I can take these virtual courses now. It made it more affordable and more approachable for me. So we've been really excited about that, to be able to bring our training to more people around the world than we ever could before. So there's a lot of good things about remote work. We, like a lot of companies, were forced to move further into that virtual space, even though it was really scary, even though it made us very uncomfortable at first. And while it was not easy to make that adjustment, now we're seeing a lot of benefits as a result. And so when I talk to other teams, other UX teams about their similar shifts into more remote work, I also hear about those same kinds of benefits. So first, we're going to think about the good things that we get from remote work. And I'm going to split this up into two different categories. So we'll think about UX work, which I'll define as like the design work, ideation, strategy, any kind of workshop, things like that. So internal UX design work. And then we'll also think about conducting UX research remotely. So we'll talk about benefits as they apply to those two sides. So first, let's think about UX work. So this first one, happier, healthier employees. That one is not unique to UX. When done well, I really do believe that remote work can give people more time at home. It can give them more time with their families. I certainly have seen this with my husband, who used to have, he'd spend an hour plus per day, per weekday, commuting to and from his office. The fact that he doesn't have to do that anymore is great. I mean, that's more time in his week. That's less stress. That's less wasted time. So that's something that can work really well. Now, I have sometimes there in parentheses because, as maybe some of you have experienced, this is not always the case. If the culture around UX, around remote work in an organization isn't quite right, it can lead to slowly eroding personal time. So that can lead to less happy employees. So we'll think more about that when we get into the downsides. But when it's done well, I think it can make people happier. Now, the second one I've listed here is a wider talent pool. So this is maybe more of a benefit for the employer, for the organization itself, for the company itself. In one respect, that's a benefit to the employer, because it means that if I want to find the best UX designer that I can, I get to open my search to anybody in the United States, potentially internationally, as long as I can deal with those tax consequences and regulations. But that means that I have so many more people to consider when I'm recruiting. And then if we think about it from the employee side, now we're starting to see that, hey, you don't have to work, you don't have to live in San Francisco, you don't have to live in New York City in order to be a successful UX professional. Not that there's anything wrong with those cities, but that up until recently, that was kind of the decision you had to make. I was born and raised in the Triangle, and I love North Carolina, and all of my family is here, and all of my husband's family is here. So when I graduated, I had to make that choice. Like, do I pick up my roots and move somewhere else and leave all my family and friends and the state that I love in order to pursue a job? Or do I stick around Raleigh and hope that I can get a good opportunity? That is definitely changing. One thing that I've seen recently is a better development of the UX and design communities outside of those locations. So like, for example, in North Carolina and other parts of the South are experiencing a huge surge in interest in tech and design. So as a born and bred Southerner who's never left the Triangle, left it, but never moved out of the Triangle, I love that. I love to see that my industry is really taking off in the region that I live in. That also means that there are more people who have opportunities, who have exposure, who can break into this field, and who can also hone their skills in deeper ways than maybe they could have before. So I'm really excited to see that sort of expansion of our field's culture. Now let's think about some of the benefits for UX research. So this first one here, stretching resources. I talk to a lot of UX teams. I have never encountered a UX team that says, you know what, we've got all the resources we need. We have all the money, we have all the time, we have all the skills, we have all the people that we could possibly need. I have never encountered a team like that, even really well-funded teams, because there's always more research that we could be doing. There's always research questions that we haven't answered yet, that we want to explore, that we need to determine, that we need to investigate. So anytime we can take the same amount of resources and stretch it and turn it into more research findings, that's exciting. That is beneficial. That's useful. So there's a lot of reasons why when we do UX research remotely, it saves us money. But one of the big reasons is that it's generally cheaper to compensate participants if you're going to be testing them remotely versus in person. Part of the reason for that is that when we compensate our participants, or when we give them a thank you gift, whatever you want to call it, we are really trying to offer them an incentive for the inconvenience of participating in our study. So anytime we can lower that bar, anytime we can lower the inconvenience, that is going to make it more likely that someone's going to consider participating. So like if I was trying to recruit you for a study and I said, okay, you have to pick between these 4 time slots on these specific dates, and you have to get into your car and drive 20 minutes to get there, and then find parking, and then walk in, participate, get back in your car and drive home. That's a much bigger inconvenience for you than if I just say, hey, you tell me when you've got an hour at home or in the office, somewhere that's quiet, that you have a good internet connection where you're not going to be disturbed, and we can do the session then. It's way more convenient. So I work on projects where sometimes we have the option, well, you know, before the pandemic, we had the option to do in-person research, and we intentionally would choose to do it remotely to help with recruitment. So for example, I had a healthcare client that's based in Charlotte, and we were recruiting doctors, and I decided to, you know, even though I could have gotten in the car, driven from Raleigh to Charlotte, it's only 2.5 hours. That's where my husband's family is from anyway. Even though I could have done that, I realized that it was going to be more convenient and more enticing to those doctors if I let them participate remotely. So that's a big benefit. It can be a recruitment tool. It can make things more convenient for our participants and make them more likely to actually talk to us. And what's even more important, I think, is that we get better access to the people that we designed for, and we can test them, we can study them, we can interview them when they are in their real life environments and using their real life devices. So this is a quote from an interview that I did recently with Funby McKinday. She is a UX researcher at Shopify. If you're not familiar with Shopify, they're very popular right now. They're a huge e-commerce platform. And I think this quote from Funby really sums up some of the multifaceted benefits that we can get from remote UX work, and especially remote research. So Shopify is based in Canada. That's where their physical headquarters is located, but they serve a global community of retailers. So Funby was telling me that before the pandemic, they used to do only in-person UX research. Part of the reason they would do that is because they had a willing pool of participants nearby. So it was really easy for them to find people who are willing to come into the Shopify headquarters and participate in studies. So they just weren't really motivated to do anything else. When the pandemic hit and they suddenly had to start recruiting remotely, they found that it was easier than it had been previously for them to include people from all around the world, to include people who weren't just in Canada or in the United States. So by conducting their research remotely, they found that it helps them make sure that they are not just designing for a North American audience, they're considering the needs of a global population of their users. So I think there is also a real inclusiveness benefit here as well. It's not just, the fact that we have to do this remotely, or it's convenient, or it's cheaper, but it can also be a better way for us to get access to these people that we designed for. I think sometimes there's also an accessibility benefit here as well. So for example, tools like Zoom, they have the ability to have live captions. That's a tool that we use sometimes for our virtual conferences, will enable live captions. That's particularly helpful if somebody speaks English as a second language and it's helpful for them to see what I'm saying. But when we conduct our studies, when we conduct UX research, it's also useful to have live captions directly on the screen. That is not something that I can easily replicate in person. I can't just walk around with, whatever I'm saying written underneath my face. So suddenly it's easier for me to include someone with a hearing impairment in a study, for example. Yeah. Remote does not always work for UX. We talked about some of those benefits, and of course there are more. But there are also some really serious challenges that sometimes block or get in the way of these benefits. Now, personally, I am optimistic that we can overcome these challenges and we can work through them. And so I'm really going to encourage you, as we're thinking about and talking about these challenges, I'm going to encourage you to think about how you approach remote work or how you might approach remote UX research. Think about that like you would any other design problem. So instead of designing a UI, you're designing the communication with your coworkers or your participants. Let's talk about 3 of the core issues that I encounter a lot. And then we can think about how maybe we as a field might be able to work past these issues in the future. So these are things that can impact both UX work and UX research. First up, remote only works if our digital tools work. And unfortunately, they do not always work. And this is a huge hurdle. And when we're dependent on this tool to be the connection between us, if that tool breaks down, we can't get any work done. So in this screenshot, so this is an example from another client project that I was doing where I had scheduled the session in advance and I did a tech check to make sure my participant had everything that she needed to participate and that her audio sounded good and all that. Then we get into the session and her Windows machine decides that it has to update. So it did a Windows update literally the entire time that we were scheduled to be in the call. And this was made even worse because I happen to have some high profile client stakeholders who are supposed to be observing. So it was a little embarrassing. So when the tech fails, the work fails. And that's a huge obstacle for remote UX work. I do think that we have a problem with unreliable technology, not just within our field, but I think this impacts every other field now that the world is mostly remote. And I think a lot of that stems from how we prioritize or maybe don't prioritize how we do product work. I've encountered way too many companies that try to cram unnecessary features, all these bells and whistles into their products, but they ignore the really severe instability problems in their core functionality. I'm hopeful that this is going to shift over time because I do think that a lot of, especially companies that are new to UX, sometimes make that mistake initially, and then they realize that's not good for their long-term relationship with their users, and so then they pivot. So maybe as our collective UX maturity improves, hopefully the stability of our tools will improve as well. I certainly think that things are much better than they used to be. As somebody who's worked remotely, either fully remotely or hybrid remotely for literally my entire career. Actually, even growing up, I saw my mom worked for IBM and she worked mostly remotely there as well. So I have seen that technology has gotten more reliable, more stable, but we're still not there yet. For now, the best thing that we can really do is try to make sure that we are using the tools that are as stable as possible. So if you're using an app that is constantly down or it's constantly buggy, it might be worth considering time to jump ship. Especially if your team is doing primarily your work remotely. It just is not worth the lost productivity to stick with something that's unreliable. I also think that networking is a big challenge here. And by that, I don't mean like schmoozing, I mean like network connections. There are some user populations, so especially with UX research, there are some user populations that we want to include, that we want to test, that we just cannot access remotely. For example, people living in really distant rural areas, or even people that don't live in remote areas, but they just have a low internet speed connection. That can be a serious challenge. Like I recently had a remote session with a participant living in rural India, and his connection was just so bad. I mean, we tried everything we could. Sometimes if you have them turn off their webcam, that can help to, improve things, but we could just barely even talk to each other and I couldn't see what he was doing on his screen. So that's not going to be a successful usability test. We just had to end the session. So that's frustrating when that happens. Sometimes there are things you can do to work around that though. For example, a colleague of mine ran a study last year and she is Chinese, so she speaks Chinese, and she was studying a group of people that lived in rural India, sorry, not India, China. And she was she was concerned that if she tested these people in their homes, their internet connection or their mobile connection was not going to be strong enough to support the bandwidth needed for the study. So what she did is she decided to partner with a local UX agency, hire them to bring these participants in to their physical location where she knew that they had a strong internet connection, and have those participants use that internet connection. Now, she was still facilitating remotely. She was still facilitating from the United States. So it's kind of like a hybrid approach there. So we're trying to get people to the internet connection if we can't get the internet connection to them. But I am hoping that recent connectivity advances like fiber internet and 5G, whenever that unrolls widespread, hopefully that's going to bring faster internet speeds to more people. And so that will enable them to either be UX research participants or maybe UX professionals themselves. So this is something that I think will hopefully change in the near future. Now, this next one, this is a really big problem for both UX research and for UX work. And so what I mean here by no shared context is that we are not in the same physical environment. We are in a compressed, limited communication environment. So for example, you guys, I'm communicating with you through my microphone, through my webcam, but you've got a very limited view of what's around me. All you can see is my face, maybe my plant, my pictures. You can't see my bookshelves, or I have a giant cat tree. Look, it's actually like 6 feet tall next to me. You can't see that. So there's limited shared environmental context. So for UX research, that can be a problem if you really want to learn about that environment. So if you're using a method where you want to study people's environmental context. So for example, like ethnographic studies or field studies. Field studies are all about following people around in their real environments, and it is inherently hard to do that remotely. I guess you could send one of those big robotic computers that they have rolling around at like tech conferences. Do you know what I'm talking about? You could send one of those, but then that would be so disruptive that would definitely change user behavior. So there aren't a lot of great solutions to this right now. We have found some workarounds, doing things like sending your participants a GoPro in a lightweight tripod and having them set that up in the physical space that you want to study, for example. One of my colleagues recently did a study where she was studying AR apps, specifically AR e-commerce apps. So she wanted to know, like, for example, when you use Wayfair's app and you're shopping for a couch and you want to picture that couch in your living room, you can sort of layer it on top of the image of your living room. But for a study like that, she didn't just want to see what was on the participant's screen. She also wanted to see their facial features, their body language, how are they moving the phone up and down? The movements were really important. So a simple workaround that she used, this was during the pandemic, so she couldn't go in person. Simple workaround that she used is she had each participant share their screen from their phone. So that showed her what they were doing with the app. And she also had them share their webcam so that she could see physically what they were doing in the space. So, are there ways to work around this? Yeah, a little bit, but I do think it's true, especially as things are right now, that there are just some UX activities that are not really well suited to remote. That may always be true. That's possible. There may just be a few things where we say, like, there are some situations where you just need to be together in person. When we think about how this applies to UX work, missing this environment, this shared context, I find that it often negatively impacts ideation work. So anytime where especially when you're trying to work with other people in a workshop, trying to, lead them to good design solutions, it can be really challenging to do that through this compressed communication channel. Part of the reason for that is that human beings are external thinkers. We like to have, places to document our thought processes. One thing that I really miss anytime I'm doing a remote ideation workshop is I miss the ability to really quickly sketch something and just show it to somebody. Now, can I hold it up to the webcam? Yes, but that's not really exactly the same thing. I miss being able to take a bunch of sticky notes and put them all up around the room and on the whiteboard and stuff. And I think there is, that's not just something that we miss because it feels nice or it feels social. I think that it is easier for human beings to think, especially when we're doing creative problem solving in an environment like that. So one thing that I've found helps me a lot, helps certainly in our virtual training, and then also helps some of the teams that I consult for, is trying to recreate that shared context, that shared visual space in the digital world. So there are lots of whiteboarding tools, virtual whiteboarding tools that can be super helpful for this. We can basically recreate those sticky notes, those doodles, those diagrams that you might be able to share really easily in person. We can do that using a virtual tool. These do have their limits. I would say it's not currently a perfect replacement for that, but in some cases it can be extremely useful. So for example, Miro has been really great for us for these virtual workshops. So we're really trying to recreate that same idea that we would have in person in an in-person workshop. All right, last, I find that this is a bigger problem for UX work maybe than it is for remote research, but this lack of transparency and also spontaneity, I think sometimes this shows up as like a lack of awareness about what other people are up to, can sometimes cause like some communication issues. It can lead to people feeling disconnected and out of the loop, or it can lead to, especially like, sometimes we encounter this because we've got people in all different time zones. It's hard to remember who's in what time zone. So, somebody might send me an email while I'm eating dinner, and I might send an email to someone else while they're asleep. And sometimes those mismatches can sort of lead to people feeling overwhelmed. Like if I get an email while I'm eating dinner, then suddenly I want to respond to that email. So I think that's one piece of the problem. That's where we start to see maybe employees being not as happy, having more of that work time encroaching into personal time, which can be a problem. I think there are definitely a lot of ways to combat this though. And this again is something I don't think is unique to UX work, just something that UX teams really need to pay attention to, because unlike other types of work, we do tend to be very communal. We do tend to work really closely with the people that are on our teams that are helping to create the products that we're working on. And so it's important to try to nurture those relationships in order for us to feel comfortable, for example, like proposing design ideas to each other. So I think this is all about really trying to find like creative ways to keep people connected, to keep them social, but not overwhelmed. So for example, we've really loved Slack for this type of communication. I find that that's a really great way to try to replicate some of that like water cooler chit chat type communication. That's not perfect because it is text-based, and there's something that gets lost in having to type out a message versus visually being able to see somebody's face. Slack did recently implement a new feature that allows you to record quick short videos. So we've been using those recently, and that's been nice. If I have something that I need to explain, let's say I need to like show a coworker how to get into the CMS, I can just record that video instead of having to describe it via text. And then also, they get to see my face or I get to see their face. So that's something that's been nice lately. This is a screenshot of our Kudos channel, which is something that we set up as a place to give each other compliments, to sort of call each other out for good things that we've done. So we give each other supportive shout outs for favors that we've done for each other, for hard work or good outcomes, or even just like important life events, like if somebody moves or has a child. So I think that does help to replicate those little like water cooler conversations. So what we see here is Maya, who is somebody who just joined us. She's new. So she's onboarding and learning lots of stuff. And she's saying thank you to Rachel for helping her through that. And then of course, here's Jacob sharing a nice complimentary LinkedIn post that somebody put about our training. So just giving each other some of that recognition, I think that can help to try to replicate some of that connection. Another thing that's really hard to duplicate, to like replicate in the virtual world, is social events. So if you went to any like virtual Christmas party or virtual baby shower or anything like that during the pandemic, you probably know what I mean. Those were excruciating, so painful. And it's because in a party, you're not limited to a single communication channel. If you walk into a party, you see groups of people clustered together, chit-chatting, and then one person can kind of peel off from one group and go walk and talk to somebody else. We don't have that flexibility, that sort of dynamic spontaneity that we get from in-person socializing. So we recently hired 5 people. So Maya is one of our new hires, and that's a big deal for us because we are a pretty small company. It feels like we rarely have more than 30 people. So that's a big new group that we just got. So one of the challenges that a lot of teams experience, especially UX teams, is that it's really hard to onboard new people and help them feel connected to the company when everybody is remote. So we did a little event where the intention was to give all of the existing employees time to get to know the new hires. 2 of my colleagues set this up. We've got some really great workshop facilitators, very creative workshop facilitators at NNG. So 2 of my colleagues, they set this up. They had each of the, so the way they did it is they had different breakout rooms in Zoom, so different smaller meeting rooms. And in each meeting room were a couple existing people. So like I was in a room with 2 other existing NNG employees. And then the facilitators took the new people, and every 10 minutes they would rotate the new people between the rooms. So we got a little bit of time to talk to everybody. And it did kind of feel, it wasn't perfect, of course, but it did kind of feel a little bit like the, the party kind of conversation that you would have. And because it was smaller, it was easier for everybody to have a chance to talk and to chit chat. So I think that just kind of struck me as like, that is one of the biggest things, like not being able to have socialization with a big group of people virtually is frustrating. But these 2 colleagues of mine, they were able to figure it out. They were, by just sitting down and thinking, how could we try to make this as pleasant and useful as we can? How can we make this work? And so they did. So I think there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of things that we need to work out, that we need to work on. There are definitely more challenges to remote work than just these. But I think you can probably see my point that remote work it's not perfect right now, and we have a lot of challenges that we have to figure out. But I think that this is definitely the direction that UX is heading. Maybe 100% remote UX work is too difficult for some teams, but I do think we're moving towards more and more. So we just need to find some solutions to these challenges. And I think particularly if you happen to be a student right now, maybe you can be one of those people who helps us move as an industry towards more successful remote work. Thanks, everybody. This was fun. I saw a lot of people in the chat, but didn't have time to look down. That was a lot for me to get through in 40 minutes. I'm used to talking for 6 hours at a time. Let's see. Did we have any questions, Erin, that I missed?
We did have some questions. First question that I saw was, where do you recommend newly graduated students start their very first UX job? Would you think that a bigger company or a smaller agency would be better, or do you have any other recommendations?
So it definitely depends on the individual person and what kind of UX you're trying to get into. I'm lucky that I got to sample a lot of different types of UX jobs. Like I first worked in-house at IBM, so like a huge in-house situation. And then I worked at a small design agency for a little while, and now I'm at a consultancy. The big choice I think you do have to make is, do you want to do more, do you want to work in-house, or do you want to work on like more of an agency setup? And the difference there is that if you're in-house, you work on the same product or maybe a family of products for a long period of time, which there's a lot of satisfaction in that. Like you get to know those users so well. And these products are like your baby, and you get to see them like grow up, and you get to be like, I put that out into the world, and I helped these people do their job better, or whatever the product or service is. So I liked that a lot. What I like about agency and consultancy work, though, is you never get bored. You're always like moving to different client projects. You get exposure to a lot of different types of UX problems and different types of products and different types of users. I also found that when I worked at a smaller agency, it was easier for me to try out different roles. So if I was, for example, curious about, doing more research, like, for example, when I worked at that agency, I was more on the design side than the research side. I liked that I got to, just bring that up with my manager, and he was like, oh, sure, you can do some research. Whereas at IBM, everybody had their roles. It was more siloed, it was more formal. So if you wanted to get into a new line of work, you kind of had to work a little harder to do that. So if you're feeling like, I don't really know what I want to work on, I don't really know what type of product or like what industry, agency might be a good place to start so that you can get a taste for those things.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's great advice. Inspiring. One of the challenges of doing the remote usability test is that there are some minimal requirements of a participant's own computer. For example, having a dual monitor is helpful if a participant is using a tablet or a laptop with a smaller screen. It is different from having a desktop with a dual monitor and, or a bigger screen. What are some best practices for taking into consideration the participant's own technology setup and equipment?
Yeah, so this is both a benefit and a drawback to remote UX research, is that people are using their own equipment. And so what's nice about that is we get more of that external validity. We know that it is exactly the device they're going to use to do this in real life, which means that we get to see what this really looks like on a real person's screen. Like I have done some remote usability testing, for example, with people with little baby teeny tiny Chromebooks, where they're like teeny little screens. And it's kind of hard to see for me as the facilitator. It's also hard for that guy to see, the participant. It's hard for him to see. So that, shows me if I'm watching him and like seeing him test a website, for example, that's got a really thick global navigation that's sticky, that stays at the top as he scrolls down. That's most of his screen real estate. So it's nice to know that. So there is a benefit, even if, it's a little frustrating for the participant or for you. It's good to know that that's a problem. The other thing that I like about being able to get people to participate on their own devices. So for context, when we would do in-person testing, we would often just have people use a testing laptop that we would set up, because it's just easier than asking everybody to install software that's going to record it and then getting the file off of their computer or iPad or whatever. Downside of that is we would have people come in and they'd be like, this is Windows and I use a Mac. My keyboard layout is different than this. This doesn't have my password manager on it. I'm not logged into any of my things. So like those are big issues. And so when somebody is using their own device, it's kind of cool that they can just, use it exactly as realistically as they would in real life. Was there another part to that question? Did I just go off on a tangent?
No, that's great. Yeah. Do you have any other best practices that you've developed for doing remote UX studies? We've all learned a lot, but we can always stand to learn some more.
Yeah. I've got a lot of them, and I put them in that class called Remote User Research. Cool. So I actually have like 6 hours of tips. Some key things that I'll say, like at a high level, are there's a big difference between synchronous remote research and asynchronous. So synchronous would be like if we're doing a usability test through Zoom, just basically like this, or an interview where, we're interacting pretty similarly to how we would interact in real life. There's still some nuances about, how you handle certain things and some things about facilitation that are a little bit different. But for the most part, it's very similar. A lot of teams use asynchronous remote research, especially like unmoderated remote usability testing, and that can be very different. One thing I'll say is I see a lot of teams using unmoderated because it doesn't require a facilitator. So people think like, oh, good, saves me time, saves me, effort. I don't have to facilitate those sessions. I don't have to talk to people. But the downside of that for qualitative research is you do have to go back through and rewatch all those video recordings. So you're saving some time. Yeah, so you're saving some time not having to facilitate, but you are going to have to pay for that when you watch the recordings during analysis. And you lose the ability to have a facilitator who can intervene in real time, ask tailored specific follow-up questions, which is Rob Gaffer says exactly. Yeah, that's super important. So, I think it's a great option for quantitative usability testing, but I would say that's one tip, is just be cautious. Don't think just because it feels cheaper that it's automatically better, because there are some hidden costs with, especially with asynchronous usability testing. But really the keys are pilot testing. Pilot testing is huge, no matter what type of, actually, you should really be doing pilot testing for most types of UX research, but especially remote, because there's all these little moving pieces, and you might get into your study and be like, oh shoot, I didn't even think about how I'm going to collect my consent form or whatever. So you really should make sure that you're thinking through all those little details and actually testing them with one like practice user, but a real user, a real participant. If that pilot test session goes well, then there you go. You just completed your first session. You don't have anything to change. Awesome. It's not wasted time. You still get data. But if you do have to make changes, then you're going to be happy that you did it in advance before you launched your full study.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Going back to your work culture that you've been able to build, aside from the text-based interactions, have you done any research or experience or observed some engaging and successful ways to build work culture in a remote environment among UX companies? Do you know of a field within UX focused on improving the experience of remote work, or does that fall into kind of the workshop facilitators and similar roles?
If there aren't already consultancies, I don't know if this is unique to UX, but if there aren't already consultancies out there who are offering to, help companies fix their remote work culture, I'm sure there will be now. I'm sure there's going to be. I think that's probably like, pretty lucrative business to get into for those of you thinking about career paths. Because I think that is something that we're all trying to figure out, is like, how do we get this right? And I don't think at NMG we haven't gotten it perfect. We're still working on it, and we've been remote forever. And so, even us, like, we still struggle with this, and there are things that, we're trying to do better about. And I think as technology changes, that changes how we can set rules around our remote work culture. So for example, some of you might have, if you're Apple users, you might have noticed that the new operating systems that Apple is rolling out right now, like, what is it, iOS 15, and then whatever the new Mac OS is, they have this new feature that Apple's unveiling called focus modes. So people can define specific focus modes. Basically what that does, it allows you to say, all right, when I tell my devices I'm in work mode, I don't want any social media notifications. I'm just going to focus on work. And then when I'm in like personal time mode, then I don't want any work emails. I don't want Slack to harass me. I don't even want to see the badge on my screen. So like being able to create, I think, cleaner barriers between our work lives and our personal lives, I think that is important. But I do think that it is up to the company to like create that culture, that just because you get an email during dinner time does not mean you have to stop eating and go respond to that email unless it's an emergency or something, or even then. So I think it is like a potential problem for a lot of companies to let this get out of hand and not keep an eye on it. But I'm hoping that sort of like collectively as an industry, we can improve in that, and maybe even have a hand in improving it for other industries as well by working on these tools. Fantastic.
Yeah, so much to consider here. I love the idea of a new career path opening up as well. Does UX research vary? Does the effectiveness vary depending on when we conduct it remotely? Focus groups, contextual inquiry, cognitive walkthrough, usability testing. How would you say the effectiveness rates when we conduct it remotely?
Yeah, so it definitely does. I think maybe what this person's getting to is like, it definitely does depend on the method, and there are certain methods that are better suited to remote than others. So like I talked about, field studies is one that it's really hard. It's really hard to replicate that virtually and get the same level of information and data that you would get if you could follow someone around in person. Focus groups, I've done some virtual focus groups, and I found that they were good, but I do think, again, we have a compressed communication channel, and a problem that often arises even in-person focus groups is that some people talk more than others. I think that uneven communication might get a little more exacerbated when we're virtual. I certainly see that that's true in like UX design workshops, where we have some people who are really talkative and willing to share more, some people who fall silent. That dichotomy gets a little stronger, a little more extreme when we're virtual, especially if your company has a culture around, oh, this is one culture tip. I personally, I know this is a little controversial, but I think that having a company culture that you have your webcam on, I do think that's important, especially if you're fully remote, because there's just so much more information we can get from seeing each other's facial expressions and facial features and body language. It also helps us prevent like talking over each other. So like if I see that Erin is like opening her mouth and about to talk, then I know to shut up. Yeah, stop talking. Yes, it's another layer of information besides simply audio. We also have the visual information as well. So I think that is something that can help to allow coworkers to sort of connect with each other and to communicate. But yeah, we definitely do see that like we sometimes have people who are maybe quieter virtually. Maybe it's harder to build rapport with participants. Like if I'm doing a remote usability test, so typically when I do any kind of usability test in person or virtual, I'll often have a little bit of an interview at the beginning of the session just to kind of build up rapport. Not too much. I don't want to be my participant's best friend because that's not good for the session either. But I want them to feel like they can talk to me and I'm not judging them and I'm listening to them. I'll usually stretch that out for remote. I'll make that a little bit longer. I'll talk to that person for a little bit more time to make sure that we really do have that rapport and they feel comfortable. And we both have our webcams on so they can see me. They don't just feel like they're talking to a voice in a box that's sitting there judging them.
That's great. You spoke to the challenges of reaching global users who may not have stable or strong internet access. And we were really impressed by your friend who connected with a local Chinese UX company to make her study possible. In your experience or in your colleagues' experience that you know of, is that an expensive endeavor? Are companies typically willing to partner without being paid? Or, I mean, do they have to be paid a lot?
So it is not a normal situation. I think that was our experience setting up this work with this agency because, well, and I think it's maybe because, you know, typically if somebody reaches out to this agency, they're probably asking them, can you run research for us and give us findings? So it was a little weird for us as another research agency to be like, hey, can you help us like be an assistant in this research project, but not actually facilitate it yourself, because we have very specific standards. We have very specific ways that we like to facilitate. So we do not like to hand that over to anybody else. And it's also our jobs. So like we shouldn't be doing it. So that was a little bit odd, but they were willing to work with us. You know, it's still money and it didn't require a lot of work for them. All they had to do was have their testing location open, you know, say hi to the people as they come in, get them set up, get them on the Wi-Fi network, and then leave them alone, but be available in case they needed them. So, you know, they charged us less than they would have charged, certainly if they had a full researcher team conducting the research for us. And it was even cheaper because prices for that kind of work in China right now are much lower than in other parts of the world. And that is a huge thing to consider when you are thinking about conducting UX research globally, is that where you are and where your participant is has a big impact on how much you're going to need to pay. What's a reasonable amount to pay? There are a lot of calculators out there. Actually, let me type this in here. I don't know the full URL, but Ethnio, which is it's a research recruiting tool. They have a calculator on there where you can put in, you know, who you are, where your participants are, and it'll help you figure out how much you should compensate.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much. How do you consider inclusiveness in the UX industry? So, you know, either in terms of building your teams or selecting your participants, what are some of the ways that we consider inclusiveness when we're conducting UX work?
So that's definitely one thing that I love about remote is I think we have more opportunity to be inclusive, and especially inclusivity across different geographical regions and cultures. I think traditionally UX has not been super inclusive. We have not been super diverse. I mean, if you look at like the history of UX, it was really very focused on the United States and Europe. That is something that is changing, and I'm really excited to see it. So, you know, we have people who show up to our classes literally from all over the world. And it's so great to see, you know, they tell us about how UX is just blowing up where they are, and there's a lot of new UX training and UX jobs available there, which is really exciting because if you believe, like I do, maybe a lot of us do, that this is a fundamental necessary service that needs to be applied to every single product and service out there. There's so much bad design. There's so much bad design out there. So it is really exciting to see the field growing and also to see the diversity in so many ways, the diversity of the people who are involved also changing. And I do think it's super important for research because you design for the people that you include in your research. So baseline, you need to be doing some amount of research. There's still tons of companies out there that are not doing this, and it drives me crazy. We have to do some kind of research. You have to know who you're designing for. And if you're only looking at a specific subset of those people, that is the only group that you're designing for, and you're leaving the needs of everyone else out.
Oh yeah, spot on. Yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad that being remote is kind of making things more equitable. One more question. Do you find any value in aggregating behavior using heat mapping software, or is that more of an idea that's kind of past its prime?
No, I like heat mapping for certain purposes, you know, like click heat maps that you can get from analytics tools that can sometimes give you information about like what people expect is linked or interactive and what isn't. So no, I think that's, I don't even know if I would really put that into the category of remote research. I feel like analytics kind of occupies its own little different category, but I definitely think there's value there.
Gotcha. Oh, we had one more come in. I think we have some time. So some areas in the world have regulations that prevent them from using certain web conference tools. You know, Taiwan doesn't allow the use of Zoom. Have you encountered situations where certain web conference tools are not allowed for use in certain areas or countries?
Yeah, that is definitely a challenge is, you know, even, so there's the issue of things being blocked in certain places, like, you know, we can't have people, and so actually my employee who, or my coworker who conducted that study in China, she's actually in China right now so that she can visit her family and also conduct some in-person research because they have the pandemic completely under control there. And so, you know, I can't send her Google Drive docs because that's something that's blocked there. So that is an obstacle for remote UX work sometimes. So sometimes it's the blocking that can be the problem. In other cases, it's just like people don't use that, or they have a different type of phone operating system that's more popular there that doesn't use that tool, that can't be compatible with that tool. So there's a lot of those issues. And I think that kind of falls into that category of like, remote is great as long as the tech works, and sometimes there is that mismatch. So we've certainly had to change our approach. Like actually my colleague who's running research in China right now, this week actually, she was going to use Zoom because we've had good experiences asking Chinese participants to use Zoom in the past, but she just had an issue running it while she was there. So she had to switch to Tencent meetings, which is like one of their competitor tools. So we do have this benefit that like, as long as your tool, if your tool isn't allowed or isn't compatible or doesn't work in that country, you can probably find an alternative because you know, people all around the world now, especially now, they all need to meet virtually. So there should be something there that you can use, even if it isn't a tool you're as familiar with.
Thank you. And I'll pass it to Gary for the wrap up.
Oh, you're muted, Gary.
Gary.
I should know better. Thanks so much, Kate. This was both highly informative and inspiring. I know I took a bunch of notes, and I know there were more questions than we could deal with. It was great to see so many alums from the past on. And I want to thank everyone for participating today. And thanks, Aaron, for hosting. Kate, I look forward to reading more of your reports, and we will see. I think we have Wei Gao doing an for the calendar year, but then we'll pick up again in 2022 with more events to celebrate our 90th anniversary. So stay well, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.